Hi everyone, Tracy Fletcher-King here. So this is the painting I'm going to be demonstrating. What I did was I started out with a drawing. Now I took a teacup that I love, which is up in the top of the frame there, and took some photos of it at different angles and then just printed that out onto a sheet of paper, and that gave me a few different angles so that I could create a composition that was a little more interesting. Sometimes if you just look at something straight on, it can look a bit bland, and I wanted to sort of have that feeling of, although there's one sort of central straight on image, I wanted a few looking as though they were cascading around the outside, just to create a little bit of interest more than anything. So what I'm doing now is I'm starting out, I'm putting in a little bit of shading or tonal work. Now the whole thing is obviously in blues and greens and those sort of colours. But often when I do any sort of shadows, and in this case the light source is sort of up where the actual physical mug is, I'll often underpaint in blues or purple, sometimes even green depending on the subject, because it livens up the shadows a little bit. If you go straight in with black, it can look incredibly flat. And in fact, I rarely use black at all for any sort of shading or tonal work. And in this case, I'm using Payne's Grey. And you'll notice that I'm actually mixing some of the Payne's Grey with the blue that I was using. And that sort of means that it will blend a bit better. It'll be a slightly richer colour, and they'll work together a bit more and be a slightly softer look, which is what I'm looking for. I try to build that up slowly. Rather than trying to get it all in one hit, just build it up slowly. And you'll see the one down the bottom on the right hand side, that actually shows up darker because it's a handmade paper and it absorbs more. So the colours are a bit brighter, but it's okay. It all works out in the end. But what you're about to see is you'll actually see the piece of paper that I worked from with the printouts. And you'll see that sometimes I actually go around the outlines. And on that page, if you go back and pause it, you'll actually see that I did a little sketch as well, just to check I had my proportions right. And I find that that's a strategy that works fantastically. It's never let me down to do that. It helps me see the line. I like having the physical object there as well if possible, but it's also great just to work from a 2D version of that object. So I'm adding in the paint. Again, you'll see that blue is a lot darker and richer on the handmade paper. I'm actually working on Bristol board, which is very smooth and light and lovely to work on, but it does slightly dull the colours, ever so slightly. And now I'm adding a tiny bit of green. Now I felt as though it was getting a little bit flat. I'm sticking with a lighter green, so I'm sticking in the same colour family. In terms of, it was a pale blue, a pale green. I'm not going to a dark green because that would be a bit too jarring. So I'm keeping it in that colour grouping, probably is a better word than family, and just adding a little bit of interest to them. Now what I'm about to start to do is to add in the background. Now before you all freak out mildly, I do work that rough and I do work that quick, and the colour is very, very strong. Now I go over the colour with some golden fluid acrylic, so that means that I can afford to be really strong at this stage because the white's going to knock it back. And because it's such a humid day when I was making this, it also means that it doesn't dry completely. So then when I add the fluid acrylics, it actually will pick up a little bit of the colour. And the other thing, which is what I'm doing now, the other thing I'll sort of mention is you'll notice when I was putting down that colour, I sort of stuck with the light source idea. So the darker colour is still on that, well, if I turn it up the right way, it's on that same side that I did when I was putting in the shading. And you'll see now as I'm adding the paint, see how it picks up little bits of the paint. It's not completely opaque, so I love that because it sort of gives you that chance of building up lovely layers in the background. You can add a bit more, you can soften it off, but it also seems to grab a little bit of the colour, especially on a really humid day. And I'm just putting it in quite roughly, adding a touch of that blue into the teacup just so it looks as though it belongs with the rest of it a bit more, and adding in some more paint So keeping with that idea that the light source is reflecting lighter onto one part, even in the background, and that makes it feel a bit more cohesive. It brings it all together so that it belongs together. Now some of the lines disappear at this stage, but they come back out. I don't worry about it too much. Sometimes they don't ever appear, but in this case they did. So what I'm doing now is I felt as though some of that dark background sort of disappeared a bit too much. And the great thing about fluid acrylics is you can pick up a little bit of watercolour and actually drop it into that paint if it's still a bit damp, and it sort of blends and it gives you a beautiful soft effect, and you still get the strong pigments. You'll have to be quite strong with putting the colour on. If you're, you know, a little bit lily-livered and a bit timid with the colour, it won't turn out as well. But this allows you to sort of bring some of that colour then into the whole background, because I wanted it to feel dynamic and have a little bit of movement to it. I didn't want it to feel static. And sometimes adding sort of the background in a fairly rough painterly way can add a lot of energy to something. Now remember too, as I said, it was really quite humid, so that gave me the chance I could work a little bit slower than you can in really dry weather, because things don't dry quite as quickly when it's humid. But even still, you do have plenty of time to work on it. This isn't something where you've got to work at warp speed. You know, you do have a little bit of time up your sleeve, unless you're, you know, probably in a desert environment. It might be a bit different. But you can see I'm just sort of adding some finishing touches, putting in some highlights so that our eyes read them as being rounded, using the white to do that, showing where the light would catch the teacups, and just adding in a few little details. On the mug there's like some decorative nicks and like little dints and things, so I'm just putting those in, checking where it would be on the one that's angled. And that's why it's good to keep those things sort of on hand, because then you can make sure you're putting them in the right space. And just sort of any little tiny finishing touches, putting in a little bit of shadow in those handles. And this is about the only time I use quite a dark sort of really solid Payne's grey colour. And then I move on to the ink. Now you'll notice very much a case of everything disappears a little bit into the background, and I like to pop things back out. So I go in with a black pen usually. Now this is a Uniball pen. It's called a Uniball I in Australia, but I have a feeling that it's called a Vision in some other countries. They're quite easy to come by here, so I'm sure they're quite easy to get in other places. And if your work's dry, I find they're fantastic. They give you a nice line, and they come in two different widths. I like this one, which is the wider one, and also the finer one. And this gives me a chance to sort of clean up the shapes, tidy up any lines that have gotten a bit of paint on them, and just pop things back out again. I can also add more emphasis to areas and create a bit more interest. But what I did feel was I felt as though it wasn't quite black enough. I wasn't getting the really thick lines, and I didn't want to have to work on them and make them, you know, sort of too dominant. So with that pen, because it doesn't work so well, so I've swapped to a dip pen, because this gives me incredibly black lines, and you'll see them there, they're just jumping out. But they are tough to work with, and you can lose some detail. I kind of like that they're a bit unpredictable and you get little splashes and bits like that. I like that myself, but I understand a lot of people don't. But see how it's really making things come together. And even extending some of those lines with that into the background, not being entirely tight with them. And that sort of gives you that chance to bring it all together. And then I'm just signing it and letting it dry really well. So look, I hope you've really enjoyed that. I hope you've learned a bit about my process, and I really hope that you give it a go yourself.